with the question of snowmobiles in the park, and new, more silent, cleaner snowmobiles would be allowed. And at least according to the NPR reporter, the ecology people, the environment people, and the snowmobile people are all reasonably happy with it. And I thought, that's really unusual. By the way, I am sustaining that running.
Thank you for that.
So rare. Like Paul, I'm a historian. Like Paul, I work on the history of this country. And most of what I do involves situations where compromise is at best putting off the inevitable. Paul spoke last night about compromise and the problem of slavery in the American Republic. I'm particularly interested now in two things. One of them, kind of like Cal, is the American family, where they are setting up what they hope is going to be a permanent peace process, which does involve some kind of compromise and does involve some kind of hope that your own crazies will get under control. I studied that, I've written about it quite a lot. The other thing that interests me greatly is what happened to Native Americans as Europeans came on and on and on and on and on. To my mind, that was not compromisable. We're looking at two very, very different ways of organizing human life, and in the end, somebody was going to lose. So I guess, as a historian, I'm kind of despairing about compromise in an awful lot of situations.
Krys, Logan?
Compromise is basically lazy problem solving. Compromise means that we've failed to reach some sort of a better solution. It means that we've had to give up something. It's supposed to be our plan B, particularly in the context of interpersonal relationships like marriage. Compromise frequently means that we've missed an opportunity and we could have had something better out of it. It's sort of that halfway point between avoidance of a problem and true problem solving and collaboration where we can actually get better solutions. For example, if you've got a husband and wife, he really likes Western art. She really likes modern art. The interior designer suggests, well, we've got the perfect compromise. We'll come up with a very modern take on Western art, hang that in the middle of your living room. What are the chances that either person is going to be happy with that? So in this case, you have a compromise that really no one is happy with, but both people feel at least it was fair, so you don't feel taken advantage of, but you've really missed out on opportunities to actually improve what the relationship would be. So kind of think of compromise as basically trying to get a win for the relationship rather than a half win for each party.
Dan, Rainey, what's your take?
Oh, last but least, not
Second to last, but not least.
well, first of all, I would say that our instructions were to make a provocative statement. And I found that rather hard because my job has been for a long time to be the guy who keeps people from making provocative statements. It's kind of difficult for me to do that, but I give it a shot. The first thing I started thinking about when I got ready to come down here was obviously definitions. And so what is compromise? How do you deal with compromise? And I rapidly got kind of frustrated because I'm just going to read a quote here from Edward Bono. Words are encyclopedias of ignorance because they freeze perceptions at a moment in history and then insist that we continue to use those frozen perceptions. I think if you define compromise in one way, you're almost guaranteed that the next person you talk to from the next discipline is going to define it another. And so maybe that's going to be part of our conversation. What is this thing that we're talking about? Well, the more I thought about it, I thought, okay, I'm going to forget about what these guys think about compromise, and I'm going to talk about it from the point of view of people who are involved professionally as dispute resolvers. What do we think about compromise? And so I asked a bunch of my colleagues to do a word association game. I said, I'm going to say the word, and I want you to tell me the first thing that pops into your head. And so I said to one of my colleagues, compromise. And she said, Butte, Montana. And I said, okay. Why? What does that have to do with compromise? And she said, oh, I thought you said copper mine. And so once we got past that, I actually got some responses. And let me just sort of read to you professional dispute resolvers' takes on immediate associations with compromise. Sharing, that's the most positive one I'll tell you. Surrender, failure, defeat, not ideal, positional, win-lose, and split the baby. I just pulled a few of those out that are represented. That's coming from the point of view of people who generally are in the business of trying to make people come to rational agreements. So I guess I would say in short that none of my colleagues had a terribly overwhelmingly positive response to the idea of compromise. I would say as my controversial, my provocative statement, that most of the time when we talk about compromise, we get it completely wrong, and we're not talking about compromise at all. most negotiation has more to do with tango, the national dance of Argentina, than it does with compromise. And if you want to unload that later, ask me a question.
So this really leads us to an interesting place, and that is how we have an effective discussion on this subject that we seem to have at least 4 definitions of already. And Paul Finkelman, maybe you could talk a little bit about that and about the sort of changing definitions of compromise over time, specifically in this country.
Well, I think we, in this country, we don't like to face conflict, even though we are, of course, a country that is shaped by conflict from the first interaction between Indians and British settlers to the conflict between the Americans and the King of England's armies, to conflicts over further settlers and Indians, to conflicts over slaves who don't want to be slaves and people who want to own them as slaves, to conflicts between slave-holding regions of the country. And I would say that there are some issues for which compromise simply cannot work. Slavery is a good example of that. You can't have a halfway point within slavery. The Puritans, who were the founders of New England, had a set of rules which essentially meant if you were not a church member, you were not a voting member of the society, because voting came through church membership, or at least in the early colonial period. And church membership required what the Puritans called a visible conversion experience. This was not going down to the camp meeting and saying, I found God, throw water on me, I'm converted. This was a much more complicated process in which many very successful people were never considered full church members because they did not have this conversion experience. And so as the 17th century moved forward, they began to run out of Puritans. There weren't enough people being converted. And so the Puritans got together and they developed something called the Halfway Covenant. And the Halfway Covenant said that if your grandparents were church members, you could be considered church members for political purposes. So you could now become voters, you could now become full participants. You have enough people to participate in society. But you're not really a church member. You still may not be going to heaven, but that's a whole separate issue. And so we're essentially going to compromise between the religious and the political. That's the kind of compromise that worked, because the people who were hammering out the compromise were, in fact, all within the same community, and they said we had to give something up to continue to do what we're doing. So I think compromise can work when people in the marriage come together and say, you know what, we'll have 2 pieces of art, we'll put one up for January, and then we'll put the Western art up for February, and we'll rotate our art, we'll get 2 pictures instead of 1. There are numerous ways, in other words, in which one can imagine individuals or small groups coming together to compromise on many things. We're faculty members, we often compromise on what should be the new standards for a particular curriculum. We compromise on who we will find acceptable as our new department chair. There are lots of things that I think where compromise works, but where it doesn't work is when you have one segment of the compromising community unalterably committed to something that they will not give up on. And you have another group which says, you have to give up on it sooner or later. You can't keep doing this forever. Slavery is obviously the most common example. Segregation here in Texas is another good example. If you read the statements of the people of Texas in the 1940s and 1950s, they basically said, as George Wallace did in 1963, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Just as when Texas seceded, in the Texas secession document, it said that we will never give up slavery. Slavery will be here for all eternity. So when you get to that kind of situation, then there are only two alternatives. You can go your separate ways, or one side outvotes the other and says, sorry, you lose, we win, and therefore you're going to, so in one case, Southerners said, we're leaving the Union, and the rest of the United States said, no, you're not, and you have war, you lose. Terribly costly. One wonders, however, if Jefferson Davis and the leaders of secession across the South had been told, you know, you're going to lose 250 to 300,000 white Southern men are going to die in the next 4 years. You may or may not win, but that's what it's going to cost you. You're willing to do it. I think they would have said yes. I think they would have said, this is not, we cannot compromise on slavery because this is our way of life. So the other alternative is you let people go their separate ways. At the Constitutional Convention, at one point, one of the delegates said, maybe we should just not try to blend incompatible things. If you go your way, we'll go our way. Let's see how it plays out. So that's the alternative to compromise, is to just say, it can't be compromised. And I think, and I'm going to finish with this thought, that within our own political system, I think the problem is we have now developed what I would call a kind of a fringe level of politics, embodied by your very, very junior senator, and equally embodied by the very junior senator who is the son of a congressman from Houston, Rand Paul from Kentucky. They have decided that everything is something that you fight to the end on, that nothing is expendable. And so you fight to the death on everything. They are, in other words, I think Ted Cruz is the new George Wallace. I will stand in front of the schoolhouse door and shout segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And eventually, I suspect what will happen is the people who have put themselves into this box will ultimately lose, disappear, and within a few years crawl back under the rocks from which they came and be mostly marginalized and forgotten. But it will take a while. And by the way, this is not the first time this has taken place. In 1856, the Know Nothing Party ran a presidential candidate on a platform which said that Roman Catholics should never be able to hold public office in the United States. They disappeared shortly after that.
Well, there are those who would argue that part of the reason that more and more politicians refuse to capitulate on anything, thanks in no small part to my colleagues in the media, is the fact that they are always running for office and they always have to be aware of the next election. Yes, please.
Yes, campaigning has infected governing in a way that it always did to some extent, but much more so today. It used to be that in campaigning, you would campaign by announcing your principles and declaring the importance of those principles, maybe even declaring them to be inviolable. And you would identify your opponents as unacceptable in some sense, or at least not nearly as good as you. So you campaign by highlighting your principles and declaring your opponents to be unacceptable. But then when you got into particularly a congressional setting, you would in fact, as LBJ did with Everett Dirksen for years, end the day with scotch. Feet up on the table, tie askew, a glass of scotch, and just talking. Him and Lyndon. And in there you would find some way to resolve major issues, but the principles of the campaign, where principles are nonviolent and opponents are enemies, is now also part of governing in a much more extensive way, and so you never get that late day social event in which you can see the humanity of your colleague and maybe hear something in conversation that permits you to say, now I want this and you want that. I can't give you all of that, but I could find some space over here where we might be able to agree. So the fact that the permanent campaign has now impacted governing so decisively is why Ted Cruz is smiling, even though he has just taken one hell of a beat. Because he goes home, addresses the Republican Women's Club, and they're, hey, this is great, this is wonderful stuff. And so he feels like, in a very real sense, he did win, even though most of his colleagues are still just shaking their head.
There's another piece to this, though, which I think is that we have, in the past 15 or 20 years, so gerrymandered the United States that most elections are not contested anymore. Now, states are not gerrymandered. So in fact, Texas can elect Ted Cruz because it's the whole state that seems to be voting for him. I mean, I think the demographics are pretty clear that Texas will be a Democratic state in 20 years, whatever Ted Cruz does. And simply, many places are changing it. I mean, the very fact that the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond and Virginia, has now twice voted for Barack Obama, suggests the way the demography is changing politics all over the country at the state level. But at the congressional level and at the state legislative level, we have so gerrymandered electoral districts that most politicians don't face any significant opposition from the other party. So the only election that matters becomes the primary. And if that's the case, then you stop speaking to anybody but people who believe as you do. And in that sense, the state legislatures are beginning to resemble the pre-Civil War South. One of the most remarkable things about the pre-Civil War South is that there is almost no public discussion about what matters, which is slavery. The giant elephant in the room is never discussed. Similarly, if you want a modern example of it, apartheid South Africa. White South Africans had complete democracy. They could discuss anything. They had free speech. They could vote. They could vote for whatever candidate they wanted. They could discuss gold policy, diamond policy, the environment, animal preserves. The only thing they couldn't discuss was the only thing that mattered, which was apartheid. And this is what happens when you get a closed society where free speech and political discourse become increasingly meaningless or impossible. Now, obviously in the United States, you still have the free speech, so you can have the political discussion. You can move into an entirely Democratic congressional district and offer your Republican values. And you can move into an entirely Republican district and offer your Democratic Party values. But the problem is that political leaders have no need to listen to you, no care to listen to you, because they don't need your votes. There's not going to be a close election, and you're just a gadfly out there. So that's a problem. We could solve that problem either through legislation or some other means, simply by creating a new method of assigning congressional districts, which would be based on coherent populations, randomly set up by computers. But of course, the politicians in both parties would oppose that, because after all, if you are under the old system, you're never going to want to change the old system, because that means you're going to be out.
I wonder, Paul, if you backed onto a couple of larger questions, particularly with your South Africa analogy. I mean, I was very active in anti-apartheid back when it was still there. And it did seem to me at the time that sooner or later this place was just going to blow up, which mercifully it did not. Now, that has something to do with de Klerk, it has something to do with Mandela, it has something to do with process. And I want to put two other points in before I pass it back to you or to somebody else. One of the elements has got to be personalities. Some people are open to compromise and some people are not. When we circulated preliminary readings, I suggested chapter 36 of Moby Dick, where Captain Ahab lays himself bare, because there is an uncompromising personality, and we know what's going to happen to the people. All right, that was obviously not declared for Mandela. It would have been perhaps Verwoerd or one of the other prime ministers under the National Party. Now, situations that can deteriorate. And I think of the British Empire. We're going to be talking about families and marriages, I think, quite a lot. And both in my book, The American Revolution, and my classes, I liken what happened between Britain and the colonies to a couple who have not talked much about their relationship. And then they begin to. And then they realize how little they've got in common. And then the plates are flying, and the next thing you know, both of them are hiring lawyers. I think that is a workable analogy for what went on in the empire. So it's situations and its structures and its personalities. Sometimes compromise can work, and sometimes you discover it will work, astonishingly, and sometimes you realize, no, this is just plain not going to work.
Yeah, and of course the other thing is you have to, I mean, for all of Ted Cruz's bravado, I think he also fully understood that in the end, his position was relatively costless. Yes, he could cost the American economy $34 billion, and he could care less. Yes, he could make life miserable for a certain number of people for 17 days, and so what? They're all government employees. He doesn't like them anyways. Or they're veterans who merely want their veterans benefits. Since we've used them as veterans, we don't really need them any longer. I think there's a certain kind of cynical level to that. But he could boldly say, I don't care if we default on our debt. Well, but you know, the interesting thing would have been if we get to default, does he suddenly either back off or not show up in Congress because he's willing to look over the cliff, but I'm not sure even he is ready to march off the cliff.
So he's not a real Captain Ahab.
And I don't think I think he knows that he will never have to march off the cliff because however spineless and gutless and lacking in any values whatsoever that Speaker Boehner has, he knows that Boehner doesn't have the guts to walk off the cliff either. And remember, the fascinating thing about the crisis is that the two most visible noisemakers, Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, were in the Senate where they already outvoted. So they can go on and they call them as they want. They know in the Senate they're going to be defeated by Republicans who are not going to jump off the cliff. And I think in the end, what happened in South Africa is precisely this: that in the end, the Afrikaans political majority looked down at the abyss and realized that the abyss would be an incredibly bloody civil war where they're outnumbered 4-1, where the world already hates them. And even if they can win that civil war, because they have most of the guns, what will be left won't be worth having. And in that sense, maybe they learned something from Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. Because in the end, of course, the Confederacy says we would rather go down in smoke and be destroyed and have everything in our culture, all of our wealth destroyed. We'd rather do that than compromise and give up on slavery.
Well, I want to jump in here and bring Dan and Krys in on this and go back to the point for a moment as it relates to everything here, but this idea of personality. Can you both speak to how often personality is the thing that allows people to compromise or, if you will, collaborate, and how often that's simply not possible based on the individuals that are trying to come together and find a tenable solution?
Can I ask you a question before they answer, which is what do you mean by the term collaborate? Because in our world it means either getting together to work collectively, or it means to be a French citizen who works for the Nazis.
Well, I said collaborate because for Krys Logan, I think the term compromise is loaded, and you essentially said compromise is almost always a bad idea. So I'm trying to get us to talk about the same thing here. When I say collaborate, I suppose I mean come to the table and be willing to work and sacrifice on both sides. Yes, I don't mean, I'm not referring to Nazi collaborators.
Within interpersonal conflict, usually what collaboration is problem solving. And if you do this when you've got a high interest in your own outcome, as well as a high interest in the other person getting his or her outcome. I think within political parties, you frequently don't have much of an interest in the other party getting his or her way out of it. Compromise would be sort of a halfway concern with your own, halfway concern with the collaboration would basically be that sort of problem solving, and getting off of positions, looking at interests, and trying to figure out what's really going on, what do you really want out of this, not necessarily just what are you asking for. If you think of styles and strategies, strategy, you're a little more intentional, you're choosing which approach. Style is going to be more like that personality, that person who wants to dominate, that person who wants to kind of win over the other person. And some of us really avoid conflict, don't like it, it's just unpleasant. It also communicates to the other person, I'm not that concerned with what you want to get out of this either. You look at accommodation, saying, you're more important than I am in this, as I view it. So you're definitely looking at personality, you're looking at choices, you're looking at feasibility. Somebody who's kind of a perpetual avoider is probably not going to be particularly good at jumping in and trying to dominate over somebody else. So we've got to get skills that go along with this too. Let's have the conversation, as you mentioned. If they've never taught, they don't know how to fight. They don't know how to disagree.
Did you want to weigh in? Dan, sorry.
Interesting conversation so far. I have made deals with too many people who are complete jerks to not think that it's possible to work with personalities. So it is possible to do that. I think from a dispute resolver's point of view, and most of the work I'm doing these days is contract negotiation and negotiation among people who have lots of money on the table. So there's lots of external factors going on that are not political, but are driving their behavior. And for me, the idea of compromise, the reason I say we almost never have compromise, really, is that most of the time it's a structured dance. And I'll give you a very low-level example. It's my favorite example of non-compromise that appears to be compromise. A friend of mine is an advocate and also a mediator, and he does a lot of other things. But he was operating in this particular instance as the lawyer for a client who had been injured and had a personal injury lawsuit against an insurance company. And so they go, and they're about to go to trial, and the judge says, would you please go off and with the mediator and see if you can work this out. And so they go off with the mediator, and my friend says, okay, here's the deal. I've got to have $1.5 million for my client, not a penny less. If you can't give me 1.5 mil, we're going to go to trial. The insurance company representative says, I got $750,000. That's it, not a penny more. You either take that or go to trial. Very inexperienced mediator looks at them and says, well, we're obviously an impasse, let's go to trial. And my friend says, whoa, time out. I'm lying. He knows I'm lying. He's lying, and I know he's lying. Give us a minute, we'll work this out. They settle for 1.1 mil in about half an hour. Now my point is that looks from the outside like compromise, but it has nothing to do with compromise. That is a tango, that is a dance. Because both of those people knew when they started that negotiation, they were going to wind up somewhere in what we would call a zone of reasonableness. There was a figure there that they both would say, yeah, I can walk away and I can be happy with it. And so they didn't compromise at all. What they did was they did a dance that got them to a place where their interests were not being violated and their positions were being closed so that they could walk away both being quite satisfied. That happens in negotiation much more often than true compromise.
But they both end up with less than they want.
No, not at all. They both end up in a zone that they're perfectly happy with because they knew where they were going in the front.
They are dancing on the same dance floor, and it is a tango.
Yes.
As opposed to doing two different, very different things, which is Paul was getting at with the slavery business, and
Sure.
I was getting at with the Navy business.
What happened in our last shutdown of the federal government is that one side was doing tango, the other side was doing foxtrot, and they're tripping over each other's feet. So you have both positions, there are three ways you can look at positions of interest. Positions of interest can be divorced from one another, they're totally unrelated. They can be connected, or they can be absolutely related. And the position that we're in with the last crisis in our government was that the positions of interest were related. You had Obama saying, adding things that are extraneous to the debate, to the discussions, or negotiation about the budget is a path we do not want to go down. It's destructive, and I will not do it. And you had the Republicans and the Tea Party on the other side saying, we have to make policy changes as part of the budget process, or we're not going anywhere. And that would have been real compromise. And when the Tea Party members who now look at the Republican Party and say, you sold us out, you compromised our values, they're absolutely correct. They did. That was a compromise. That was moving from something that they didn't want to give up, they thought they could get, that had real value for them.
Yeah, that's the key
Absent
point.
that,
That's the
it's
key
not
point,
compromise.
which is that you can arrive at a middle ground, which you can do most easily in a financial discussion. I want 1.5, 0.75, and you end up right in the middle. But what people refer to, I think, as the classic compromise is when both sides give up something of their fundamental values, where they're losing, and in which they acknowledge that they're giving up something that they greatly value, and the other side is also giving up something that they greatly value for a mutual improvement in the current circumstance, which is much less common.
And also to avoid the abyss. I mean, what you see the story you gave of the two attorneys, of course, is neither of them actually wants to go to trial because they both know that going to trial.
They're going to do what they want.
Well, for one thing, going to trial is going to cost them more than the difference between 1.5 million and 1.1 million, or 750,000 and 1.1 million. Insurance companies say, look, if we go to trial, the cost is going to be enormous, and we might lose really big. So we don't want to do that either. And again, what I think you have in the last political crisis is not a tango, but one side was dancing the tango, the other was trying to play the game we used to play when I was 9 on a bicycle called chicken, where you each drive your bicycle head on into the other and see who has the guts to bang into the guy who's going to swerve. And of course, I always knew kids who would in fact bang into each other because they were too dumb to figure out that banging into somebody on a bike is really stupid.
Well, let me tell you, we're at this place now where it's whoever has more guts that ends up winning sometimes. And I mean, I think a lot of casual observers would say that is not. No one is really sitting down to consider the shared interests that we might have. There's the abyss in which we all implode. But it seems really detrimental to our society that the one who just isn't afraid to wreck it all ends up winning.
Well, that's not exactly where we are completely, though. Because if you look at the conference committee that's created out of the legislation that brought everybody back to work, there's a conference committee to talk about budget. And Patty Murray on the Democratic side, the senator from Washington State, is going to be one of the leaders for the Democrats in the conference committee. And she summed this up, I think, absolutely perfectly. And we'll see whether or not the tango is going to happen, whether the other side will do it. What she said was, I'm going to go into the room and I'm going to bring a budget. And Paul Ryan's going to come into the room and he's going to bring a budget. I'm not going to accept his. He's not going to accept mine. We're going to negotiate. Now, if they can take the positions they start with and negotiate far enough away from their principles so they feel like they're not violating their principles, then we're going to have a tango and we're going to be okay. If they're not able to do that, we're going to be right back in the same position we were before, where anybody's movement is really, really difficult and really, really painful. Ted Krys is a matter altogether. We can drop him if you want to. But forever, people have been negotiating where their principles and their interests are tied up in their positions. And one of the things that we try to do as third parties is we try to say, what are your real interests here? Can we separate the position that you've opened with from an interest? And can we talk about the interest as opposed to the position? Is that a way to move forward? We'll see if Murray and Ryan can do that.
In this most recent fight, there were well more than two sides, because the Obama administration, at least the White House, were looking back over 5 years and saying that when we did the stimulus bill, we put in 40% tax cuts, not because we wanted to, but because we thought that would help us garner some Republican votes. We didn't get any Republican votes. And they thought that had played out several times that way, where they had included Republican ideas and benefits, but never got any Republican votes. And so the White House said, we're not going to do that again. We're not going to bargain with them on these issues, and we're going to tell them that until they're convinced. McConnell and Boehner were visibly willing to compromise, or at least enter into discussions for weeks with the Obama administration, but they had in the Republican conference in the House, a group of 36 or so who wouldn't permit it, and Krys and McKinley and others in the Senate who were playing their own different game, well away from their Republican colleagues. And once you got to the abyss and everybody stared over and you were a day away from default, Boehner and McConnell said, God damn it, we have got to finish this. Krys, get to the back of the bus. Shut up, go away. And whether or not the kamikaze wing of the Republican conference and Krys and Lee and Rand Paul and a few others can recoup themselves and come back to a position where they can again force the Republican majority in the House, minority in the Senate into a position of non-negotiation, I think is open. One of the benefits of this last fight may have been that Krys and Lee and those guys discredited themselves sufficiently that McConnell and Boehner will move around them earlier in the next confrontation, maybe in this committee.
Yeah, I'm not totally comfortable that that will happen, but I certainly hope it will. There's something in the conflict resolution, there's something called a BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement. And for most of the people who were involved in negotiations on the budget, the BATNA, the best alternative, did not involve not paying our bills as a country, did not involve basically embarrassing us to the rest of the world. The BATNA for Krys and Paul and the people who are on the far right wing of the Republican Party was a totally different matter. I mean, they were playing a different game altogether. And not only were they not dancing the tango, they weren't even involved. And I would say that they're all actually quite happy with the way it came out because they got pretty much what they wanted. They got personal satisfaction and personal notoriety, which I would argue was their interest all along.
By the way, this goes to your point, because a few minutes ago you said that the people who are most willing to be extreme win. I forget the exact language you used.
Whoever keeps going on the chicken bicycle.
Yeah, right. But in fact, what happened is on the chicken bicycle, Ted Cruz and his crowd continued on the chicken bicycle, and everybody else said, "We're going home for dinner." And
There's another way to win.
And so in a sense, what the guys on the chicken bicycle ended up with is their personal satisfaction, and maybe they will take this one step further and say, we're going to have our own political party, we can call it the bicycle chicken party, and then you would actually have either a third party or a wing of the Republican Party, and if they go the third party route, that historically has been your doom. I mean, there's only one third party in the history of the United States that has been successful, and that was Abraham Lincoln's party. And I don't think, somehow it just doesn't strike me that the health care law is quite the same thing as secession and slavery. I don't think people are ready to die over it.
But I will tell you that there is in D.C. now actively a lot of discussion about the third party option. I mean, people are already talking about it seriously. Everybody in K Street where my office is, all the lobbyists are talking about it.
Now, is there any possibility that these third party people are really plants being paid by the Obama administration?
I love conspiracy theories.
Because it seems to me that right now, Ted Cruz is Obama's best friend.
Yeah. The No Labels group that tried to organize in the last presidential election, you're hearing from again, but that is the sort of running down the middle of the field and pulling together all the moderates is unworkable, not likely to be more successful in the
That's
future
what Bell and Greg
has been
tried
the
to
past. But if you do get a factional division within the Republican Party, that is probably their demise for a while.
I mean, the know nothings killed the Whig Party, and whereas I don't expect the modern know nothings to drinking tea to kill the Republican Party, I think they will cripple it for a while.
Yeah, the Dixiecrats didn't quite kill the Democratic Party. Remember the 48 election, but it certainly threatened.
Yeah.
So we've established that you don't, some kind of solution is possible even if the opposing parties cannot stand each other. How important is trust for any any kind of version of compromise.
Can I bring in another outside case here?
Please.
Northern Ireland. I lived in England during much of the Troubles. People I know were close to some of the bombings. I was not far away from the city of Birmingham when a big bomb went off in the pub and killed several hundred people. So I saw some of this, not quite when I spoke close enough. And obviously I'm delighted that the peace process did work and is pretty much greatest achievement as far as I'm concerned. But behind that, there was the matter, Krys, that you brought up with trust. And I'm thinking of two things. One of them is Cardinal O'Fee, the Catholic Archprimate, being asked what he would do if he actually met me in Paisley. And his response was, I would talk to him as one Irishman to another. And that may well be part of what happened. It may well be that some level of trust could actually be established across that gap. The other is a point that I raised in my opening comments, that when this is underway, your own crises have got to be kept under control. Can I bring in one other thing, though, please? Gender. You're the only woman up here. And I'm thinking of the contrast with the article in the Times quite recently about the women senators, Republican and Democratic alike, who seem to be working across the aisle much more effectively than the guys are doing, and that just has not come into our conversation.
Anyone else want to comment on the idea of trust and whether it's possible to compromise if it does not exist?
Well, one of the things that we sort of take as an article of faith is that parties, when they come together in a serious negotiation where there are things that they really value on the table, are not going to bring a lot of trust with them in the first place. You do find that, but more often you find a lot of distrust. And so you begin to look at, can you craft either a process or bring in another element, a third party or whatever, where trust can reside in the process or trust can reside in the judgment of the third party, as opposed to trusting each other. And what we find very often is that as you move through the process, you begin to develop trust between the parties, because they can start that way, but they begin to trust the process and they begin to have successes with one another. And that helps out an awful lot. So I think trust is an essential element, but it doesn't have to be trust among the parties. Some idiot put my name forward to mediate the super committee back when I remember when that was going on. Somebody in Politico said, gee, you ought to bring in a mediator and mention your name. And I thought, oh, please do not even get close to that. It's such a disaster waiting to happen. I don't want to be standing there when it all goes to pieces, which is what we did. But they were even willing to trust the process. They weren't willing to trust anything. That's one of the problems with our current sort of situation across the aisle now, is that there's no person being trusted, there's no process being trusted, there's no motive being trusted. Everybody's sort of,
I have the idea that trust has waxed and waned in the American process over history. That there are periods in American history where we have had more trust across party lines, more ability to talk across party lines, reach agreements across party lines, but that is always at risk and you can lose it. And we're in a period now, if you think back to the 1950s, when Lyndon Johnson is the majority leader in the Senate and Eisenhower is president, and LBJ has the idea that he wants to help Eisenhower, particularly on foreign policy, that he's going to cooperate with Eisenhower on foreign policy. You think about the two Irishmen, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, and just last week, Tom Holt of Washington State died, and all of the encomiums at his death were of the fact that he sought compromise and sort of rational discussion. So at some points in American history we've had that and benefited by it, but at other points, the 1850s, yesterday, we haven't had. That lack of trust really makes it difficult to get a process started, because trust can build in a process, but if it's radically lacking at the beginning, as it was the super committee, it's likely to break down.
It is possible, because you look at the guys, and I do mean guys, unfortunately, who made the deal ultimately in the Senate. You have two individuals who are in leadership positions who basically loathe each other, who are actively engaged in primary campaigns to try to defeat the other, who were the two who finally came together and made it happen with a big push from the Women's Caucus in the Senate. But these are guys who don't like each other at all. And if they saw each other on the street, they don't talk to each other. But they were the ones who were in a position in that process to say, we have to do this.
And these are who?
Oh, McConnell and
Reed? Yeah, I just want to, The other thing that strikes me is the other model is not the negotiation between lawyers for insurance companies and plaintiffs, but prosecutors and defense lawyers who make deals all the time. And they make deals all the time on the understanding that while they may hate each other and they may despise what each other stands for, they trust that when the deal is made, the deal will stick. When the defense attorney says, if my client will testify against him, you're going to go for X. And the prosecutor says, the last thing in the world I want is to let your client walk in a year, but I'm going to do it. Yes, it's a deal. Invariably, in almost every situation I know, the prosecutors and the defense attorneys stick to their deals. Because otherwise, the whole system down the road, the future, will break down, and they can't afford that.
One of my colleagues once said, you can sell your integrity once.
That's exactly right. And so prosecutors and defense attorneys who despise each other routinely negotiate it again because neither wants to go to trial. Both has something. The other piece about compromises is that you get compromise when both sides have something the other side needs. And I think that that's always essential for compromise. I don't have to compromise with you if you don't have anything I need. If all you can do is threaten me, then maybe we can play chicken. But if you actually have something that I want, then I think there's a much greater chance of compromise.
It's a lot of different kinds of trust and bases of trust. I don't think the attorneys would trust each other very much if there wasn't a written agreement. You look at how long and detailed collective bargaining agreements are between multi-party negotiations. These things are hundreds of pages, in some cases thousands of pages that specify every single condition. You have the sort of calculus-based trust that says, if you did this, this is what the consequence is. If you don't do it, here's what the consequence is. I can absolutely hate you, personally despise you, not trust you at a personal level, but you're going to go along with the contract because it specifies what it is. With personal relationships, you don't necessarily like to say, oh, I trust that you're not going to cheat on me because in our prenuptial agreement it specifies what the consequences are. You like to trust the person. And you also have the trust of the relationship is too important. And I think a lot of times you trust that you can control your crazies because the party is too important, or the identity of the group, the kind of collective identity is too important for anybody to do anything to it. You may personally distrust the individual, but they value us too much to do anything to it. And it's not always the case. As you say, sometimes parts splinter off when they don't value the relationship more than their own interests.
Is it possible that the crisis we face is due to the fact that the parties are not important anymore? And that someone like Ted Cruz does not need the National Republican Party? All he needs is to win the Texas primary. And if he wins the Texas primary, because the Republican candidate always wins these days, in the election, there's a disconnect between national political parties, I think, and people in government today. And you see it, by the way, with President Obama, who has been stunningly absent in congressional campaigns. Even when Ted Kennedy died, Obama somehow could not find 5 minutes to go to Massachusetts to campaign for Kennedy's Democratic successor, and then suddenly Senator Brown was the Republican senator from Massachusetts, and Obama's like, well, how did that happen? Well, part of the reason it happened is because you couldn't get your behind out of Washington because you don't really care about the party either. You only care about being president.
Well, I think your observation about the gerrymandered districts and the fact that you have primary elections and regular elections now are just different than they used to be, I think is a very telling observation. I mean, I know this is going to sound like an old fart who's been around Washington for a long time who's talking about the way it used to be, but I do think the level of discourse has degraded to a level that I haven't seen since I've been in D.C., and I've been there quite a long time. It's just different than it used to be. It's more acrimonious, there's less trust, there's less reaching across the aisle. It just is.
Are we trying to win for the sake of winning to a greater extent than we have in the past?
Well, politicians are always about to win their re-election. Isn't it a question of what is the strategy that gets you to win? So that if you think, I mean, we have the situation where if you think that the best way to get reelected in Kentucky is to oppose any compromise at all, i.e. Rand Paul, then you oppose any compromise, whether or not at the dinner table you sit down and say, you know, this compromise would actually be good for the country, and it really would be good if we pay our debts, but that won't get me elected.
Right, the definition of what winning is changes. Is winning something that's good for all of us, or is it something that's good for me and mine?
Yeah, there are different things to be won by different people, and so it's not a single game with one victor at the end. You know, different people had different things to win, and some of those things were incompatible. But if you look at Mitch McConnell, not a figure that many people warm to very easily, but he actually put something at risk in this resolution, because he's running in Rand Paul's Kentucky, and he has a challenger. The challenger is plausible. He's got a lot more money than the challenger does, but if
But he also got a $2.3 billion dam as part of the deal.
well, that doesn't buy you as much electorally as it used to. In fact, it's damning for some folks that you brought that home. So, you know, he did put I didn't realize it was black. That, you know, he actually
It's not going to bring him a flood of new votes, is that
right? He did.
I'm out here if you do that.
Yeah, he did put something at risk at the very end when he knew that he had to. And we'll see whether that costs him or not.
Cal, does this have something to do with the very nature of our system? I've been in Parliament during the days, and I've heard them shout back and forth, but everybody knows they're going to go downstairs to Andy's bar afterwards and have a drink, and the losers will always lose. They can shout as much as they want, they will lose. Whereas the way we've got it structured now, you can be effectively in opposition, but also in power at the same time. Power is at stake, which is not the same that you find in the parliamentary system. A lot of people push the comment on this. I'd like your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I mean, the obvious difference between a parliamentary and separation of power system is that when you win in a parliamentary system, you win control of the executive and the legislative branch that counts, and so you can enact your program in its entirety. Whereas in a separation of power system, we have the potential for circumstances like we have now, Democratic president, Democratic Senate, but below 60 votes, and a Republican majority in the House divided internally, and that is a recipe for stalemate. And then the question is whether or not that's what Madison and his colleagues had in mind. They certainly wanted some degree of stalemate, or a process that worked slowly enough that people could watch it and get in the way if they wished. Whereas in a parliamentary system, if you win, then the decks are clear to enact your program. So, you know, it's certainly a very significant difference. And the consequence is substantial. But if you look at the American economy over the last 3 or 4 years, while our politics has been embarrassingly stymied, your 401k has done really nicely. You know, so I don't want to make that, but I'm happy for it.
Of course, Madison and the other framers did not like political parties, nor did they imagine they would emerge. And what they believed would emerge would be temporary factions that would come together for a temporary victory on one issue, and then disperse, and a different faction would come together for the next. And of course, before we get too excited about parliamentary systems, we should say yes, in Great Britain, where you basically have at most 3 parties that are functional, you can carve together a majority. Let us not forget, now does Belgium yet have a government? And does Italy currently have a functioning government? You know, let us not forget the other alternative to the parliamentary system, which is the inability to govern anything at all for long periods of time.
I wasn't taking Woodrow Wilson's position, I was just raising this.
Okay.
Is the widening chasm between the parties that we do have in this country, is it because we can no longer agree on what is the collective good, or because we no longer value the collective good?
Well, it's about race. It's all about race. It's all about the fact that the descendants of George Wallace and Lester Maddox took over the Republican Party in the 1960s, and they have managed to appeal over and over again to fears of white suburbanites. It is Willie Horton, and it comes up in when you see the Tea Party people waving the Confederate flag at Tea Party rallies. And while there are people in the South who will tell you that the Confederate flag is our heritage and it has nothing to do with slavery, it is worth remembering that when did the Confederate flag start flying in the South? After 1865. When does it appear? 1954. There are no Confederate flags being flown and manufactured. The state flag of Georgia and Mississippi, which put the stars and bars on it, they add that after the Brown decision. And so I think in part what we're seeing in much of the country is a fight about race and a unbelievable paranoia on the part of large numbers of Americans that somebody who is not white is sitting in the White House, and the White House is supposed to be for white people. And I think when you see the incredible rudeness towards President Obama, what was the congressman from South Carolina, Joe Wilson, who gets up in the middle of the president's State of the Union message and says, liar. John C. Calhoun would never have done that to Andrew Jackson, however much he did. Lyndon Johnson would never have done that to Dwight Eisenhower. Nobody, nobody got up in the middle of Bill Clinton's speeches and said philanderer. And the level of part of the problem is the fact that a substantial number of people in the United States simply do not accept the legitimacy that somebody born in the state of Hawaii could be a citizen of the United States, somebody who has an American citizen mother could be president, or who is partially black could be president, and yet have no problem at all with the fact that John McCain was not born in the United States, or Mitt Romney for that matter.
Or Ted Cruz.
Or Ted Cruz, yeah. So I mean, if you look at all this, we haven't talked about this. We talked about slavery, but beyond that, I think it is deeply about a huge racial divide in the United States that nobody wants to confront. Nobody talks about. It's the elephant in the room. Now,
I absolutely agree that race is a systemic issue in this country, and it isn't going to go away. I would add to that another reason why we have as much polarization as we have, although I don't disagree with what you said, is that I think there really has developed a different vision of what's good for the country with the two parties. Again, I sound like an old fart who's looking back and talking about the good old days, but if you look back 30, 40, 50 years ago, there were some notion of I am my brother's keeper on both sides of the aisle. And how we define our brother and how we define how far we're going to go to help keep them have really become much more polarized, I think, over the last couple of
well,
years.
some of my friends would say our brothers don't include the brothers.
Well, I think that's right. Race is very, very important, and I think race has also changed our sense of who our brothers are, but I think it is also part of the small government, low tax, deregulation, personal responsibility. There is a cover story in, what is it, Time? Tyler Cowen, the economist, libertarian economist, has made the argument that the rest of the country is becoming Texas. This will scare the shit out of Paul over here. That the rest of the country is becoming like Texas, by which he means that the low-tax, small government deregulatory model is business-friendly, leads to job growth, leads to population movement, but also leads to the hollowing out of the middle class, in which those who have the educational and creative credentials to create substantial value are very, very comfortable, and all those people who don't are devil take the hindmost. And it's that. And in Texas, blacks and Hispanics make 57 and 52% of Anglo median family income. So there is an extraordinarily heavy racial dimension to haves and have-nots. And I think the sort of low tax mantra, the refusal to fund education, has a lot to do with race as well, and will work to the extraordinary detriment of Texas in coming decades.
But even, you know, when you talk about the low tax small government, the biggest low tax politicians come from the states that gets the most money per capita from the federal government. Sarah Palin's a part.
I wouldn't go there, that hypocrisy.
The
hypocrisy of the white is.
But the hypocrisy has to be laid out there, because when you listen to the people from Alaska, like Sarah Palin, or the governor of Arizona, whining and complaining about big government, and you see that for every dollar Alaska sends Washington, $6 come back to Alaska, and for every dollar from Arizona, $4 come back to Alaska. And Texas is probably getting $2.50 for every dollar it sends to Washington, D.C. As somebody, by the way, I should say, I have lived in Texas. I have voted in Texas. I was 3 times a delegate to the Texas Democratic Convention when it was the majority party in Texas, which shows how old I am. But now that I happen to live in New York State, I think it would be wonderful from the perspective of New York taxpayer if we had what the Tea Party wanted, because for every dollar that New York sends to Washington, D.C., we only get about 82 cents back, and the rest is going to Mississippi and Texas and Alaska and Arizona. And if that's the kind of country we want, the big winners, Texas will do okay for a while until it truly runs out of water. It's not running out of oil. It's running out of water that will be the problem, because you won't have any Western water projects. You won't have any Army Corps of Engineers providing drinking water, and you'll have to buy it from Michigan.
So does anyone on this stage believe that we can return to a state in this country where, as a society, we are interested in engaging in compromise on a regular basis?
I'm optimistic. Pendulums swing. We're at one, I don't know whether we're as far as we're going to get or not, but we're sort of on one side. But pendulums swing in history, and I think it'll go the other way. That's my belief. If I didn't believe that, I would just go home and get some of that scotch you were talking about and just numb myself. But I am by nature, as a third party, I'm an optimistic person, so yes, I think.
You can be optimistic and numb too. You don't want to think of those things as alternatives.
I like the way
that's
I'm optimistic that after this is over, we'll go out and get numb. But I mean, I've said over and over again last night and today, I think we have seen the apex of the Tea Party, and it's downhill for a while. And I think if the Republicans are smart, they will have learned from this experience, and they will purge themselves of these people and tell them to go back, go back home and shut up. Which, by the way, is what the Democratic Party did, and it only took them one election. It only took the George McGovern election for the Democratic Party to essentially state to the crazies within the Democratic Party, you know, you can be the senator from Wisconsin or Minnesota once in a while, but you're not going to be controlling the party. We're not going to turn the party over to what is a far leftist faction of the party. And the result has been pretty successful.
I'm hopeful, but it does require a different sense, I think, of what conservative means. And my hope rests on the notion that some kind of genuine Burkean conservatism can return. People who call themselves conservatives right now are really very radical, especially the extreme of it. But a genuinely Burkean conservative understands, first of all, that people who have bright ideas about making things better just might be over-enthusiastic, just might be ignoring the possible costs. And people of that sort do understand that systems are worth preserving most of the time, sometimes a system has to go. But I think it would rely, that a return to sanity would rely on a genuine understanding of conservatism's place in a larger political spectrum.
One thing I'm thinking of is, not being a historian, not being a political scientist, I don't want to vote for anybody who actually wants to hold office. And it's being that emphasis on I win, it's about me, it's about either individually or my party wins. And if you look at people's involvement with local politics, I think you still have some differences in terms of people that are out there trying to make a difference to get your school district, this or that or the other. And
Notably, local elections are very seldom extremely political, at least, municipal elections.
Texas school board?
say why.
We're running out of time here.
So it's, in terms of my view of being, I guess, optimistic versus pessimistic, and if we start seeing people who actually do have an interest in collaboration, people who have an interest in working together to create something for a country, whatever that may be, rather than what's in it for me, what's in it for my party, how do I get reelected. You never see politicians talking to politicians, you see them talking to cameras or reporters. Being a complete outsider, that's not something that really appeals to me.
You can talk about the Texas School Board if you want to. Just making a joke.
No, I want, do these people get to collaborate with us?
Absolutely, that's the next stage in the program. We have 2 microphones over here, and I would ask that you do go to the microphone so that everybody in the room can hear you. But if anybody wants to step up to this, we'd love to invite you to join the conversation.
Yes, I have a question. They just formed a committee from both houses with both party members. And I don't know the structure, who they put in. One of them is the House champion of the budget, I've forgotten his name.
All right.
But are you familiar with who are on the committee and what the chances are they're going to come to a compromise?
Well, I know Patty Murray is one of the leaders on the Democratic side of the Senate. And, Krys, to be honest with you, I can't remember who all's on there. They're actually posted now on the congressional websites. But I don't remember all the members. There are about 15 of them.
Yeah, this smells a lot like the super committee of a couple years ago. It was structured very much the same way, but had a much broader mandate. The mandate here is more to begin a process of what they call the normal order, which is the normal budgetary process. And the only thing that might make me a little bit more confident that something could happen this time than with the super committee is we just came out of that major confrontation in which the Republicans took quite a shellacking. And so we'll see, but I'm not all that, I mean, Ryan is not by nature a compromising type guy.
Well, that was my question.
Yeah.
Do we have on that, I'm wondering, do we have on that committee some people who say, we'll never raise taxes?
Well, yes.
Yes, it is.
That's the starting point. All the Republicans.
Many people on, or very many of them, it's different.
Well, the difference is, though, that on the conference committee, you do have some of the adults in the room are there. And so you're talking about a different dynamic than the spectacle that you saw play out in the open debates in both the House and the Senate. What will be interesting will be what spin-offs, what happens outside the conference committee that's talking about the budget, because there are a number of other issues having to do with the Affordable Care Act and some other things that could be dealt with outside of that venue. You have to remember that the government is now funded through January 15th. And one of the primary reasons for creating the conference committee is to get a budget together so we don't shut the government down again come January 15th. But you still have the debt limit mixed in there, you still have the ACA mixed in there. And so I'm kind of curious to see how they're going to organize things in that committee and then what happens around the committee. But I'm a little more optimistic. I predicted several months ago, I started telling the people at the agency where I am, that we're going to shut down. And they kept saying, now they're going to work it out. I said, no, you don't understand. These people have their interests and their positions so closely entwined that they can't back away from it. We're going to shut down. I don't have the same feeling about the conference committee, but I'm not a Pollyanna about it by any means, but there are some people there who know what they're doing as politicians, which means they should be able to make some sort of deal. And I'm hopeful. I don't know if you guys have a different opinion on that.
two things that haven't, and thank you for mentioning gender, because I'm having some of the same, there are so many sort of aspects of that that I think come into play around compromise, but there's money and lies. A big part of what's going on politically in this country has to do with changes in campaign finance law and the equation of money with speech and Citizens United and so forth. And I believe before the Supreme Court this session is a case allowing an increase in sort of individual contributions, sort of taking the cap off of that. And money is going to pay for sort of misrepresentation of policies, and so you have people in the Tea Party going to demonstrations, holding up signs, saying, "Take government's hands off my Medicare," and you know, Hannity just a few days ago having 3 different couples on talking about how they were going to be damaged by the Affordable Care Act, and then research being done which showed that they hadn't been on the site, that there was just a misrepresentation of the agency. So with the Koch brothers in combination being the richest person in the country and the impact that they have on funding campaigns of people who are going to support their interests, what do we do with sort of money and lies in relationship to compromise in the political arena? How can you compromise with people who are either being lied to or who are liars themselves for gain?
Well, lying in politics is hardly new.
Oh, no, I'm not saying this, but there's something about the scale and the extremity of it.
And of course, when the Affordable Care Act came down, most of my friends, some of whom are Republicans, but most of my friends who are Democrats, said, you know, this is a catastrophe. And I looked at it and I said, I don't think it matters. And this was heresy among many of my friends. But I said that the Affordable Care Act, the campaign finance case.
Citizens United.
Yeah. Would have been a fabulous gift to the Republican Party in 1980 or 1972, when fundraising was basically done by mass mailing and by phone calls to very rich people. And if in fact we had opened up the wallets of the very richest in America, most of them would have given to Republicans, and Republicans would have done very well. What we've seen in 2 elections, including one since Citizens United, is that the Republicans cannot outraise the Democrats in money, because for every billion that the Koch brothers put up, Obama could raise $1.5 billion at $25 a shot with a click of a mouse. And so the whole, and Cal who's actually a political scientist, may want to correct me on this, but my sense is that fundraising is now pretty equal. Republicans may have a slight edge, and the other piece of Citizens United was, of course, it began with a film. It was a lie, but it was an anti-Hillary Clinton film. It was a lie. There are lots of lies out there. What I'm waiting for is for the Democrats to get really smart, which they haven't done yet, but maybe there's hope, and go to their side, which is to, in the next campaign, get Steven Spielberg to make a 15-minute. I would rather have 15 minutes done by Steven Spielberg than $15 million for the Koch brothers to hire somebody else to do the film. And if you think about where the power bases lie in America, the Democratic money and talent power bases are in Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and the internet. I don't see that Citizens United harms them if they unleash that sort of play. Now, what you will have, of course, is competing lies on the media. But again, given the internet, and given the ability of anybody to put up a website and say anything they want anyways, we simply have to begin to understand that you have to reach the electorate in a different way. The other thing, and I don't know, maybe is there political science evidence that any of this actually matters? That is, are people swayed by arguments anymore?
Well, the Citizens United and similar cases, including the one argued 10 days or so ago, are bad constitutional law, I think, and bad for the country. But in fact, most corporations have looked at the opportunity to contribute money politically and said, look, we got customers who are Democrats and Republicans. If we contribute strictly to the Republican side, our Democratic customers are going to get upset and boycott or something. So they've been really pretty careful. I think the more dangerous money is the Carl Road GPS kind of money that can be raised and try to affect a lot of races. But if you look at 2012, that money went down the rabbit hole. So, you know, as law, it's bad law, but as practical politics, it hasn't been all that destructive.
I agree, it's completely bad law, speaking as a law professor.
If you look at it from the point of view of communication theory, what's happened over the last couple of decades, really the last decade since the mid-90s, is we've had a very strong shift away from the way we traditionally have ingested information, put it that way. And so what you're finding more and more now is people are able to seek out information with which they are comfortable. And so instead of everyone seeing the same thing and seeing the same lies that are paid for by lots of money to get on 2 or 3 channels, what the electorate tend to do is to selectively go to those sources of information where they're going to be comfortable. And so this law that we have that allows you to spend a lot more money means you can make a lot more of those channels. But you know, let's just take anybody on those panels as an example of that. I think we've got a pretty good idea of what your politics are. They're not far right wing. You're not likely, unless you're doing a research project, to seek out the outlets that are going to be far right wing for you to consume with it.
No, I mean, unless I have no alcohol at home and I need to be numbed, I do not watch Fox News.
Yeah. And so we self-select, and a lot of the money that goes into campaigning is self-selected money that reinforces a position that may already be there or may sway some people. But I think, to answer your question directly, I haven't ever seen any research that says that the amount of money that you put into a campaign changes a lot of people's minds. It reinforces things, it makes them feel better, and it sways people who might be on the fence. But if you have a position that you hold now, I haven't really seen a lot of evidence that you can change that.
There's one other piece of the finding, which is I think that in the last election, the Democratic Party put a lot more money on the election day get out and vote rather than in Karl Rove kind of ads. I mean, what's astounding about the 2012 election is how much money Mitt Romney wasted on his friends, and that a man who made his fame by being a quantitative analyst of the finance world had such incredibly bad surveys that he actually on election day did not have a concession speech drafted because he assumed, despite all the evidence of every other polling, that his polling was correct and everybody else was wrong. That's sort of proof that really the right man was defeated because he sold us on the idea that he was really a smart analyst, and clearly he didn't know how to hire a smart analyst.
Yeah, that makes me think about the op-ed column in the Times during Bush's presidency. It was an aide saying that telling the interviewer that he was deluded because he was living in a fact-based universe and we weren't, you know, so that's similar to that to me. And I appreciated what you said about
There's somebody behind you, that's all.
Oh, I'm sorry. But about redistricting, 1.5 million more voters voted for Democrats than Republicans in the last election, if I'm not mistaken. So
In the House.
in the House, yeah, it's a real problem.
So my question had to do with deliberative democracy, because I think what I really wanted to ask is, it gets to this question of, is Congress doing what it needs to, what it maybe has done historically to function as a body? And the example of the conference committee. And I feel like what I had heard when I've read the news and so forth is that budget hadn't actually come to a conference committee. So what I wanted to ask, or they hadn't recently gotten the two budget people together to try to negotiate this. And I guess what I wanted to ask is if there are historical examples of the actual operation of Congress, not just the people in it, not just our political persuasions, but the actual operation of Congress kind of going back and forth between whether it's really doing its job as a deliberative body. And because that, I think, if that is if that is kind of ballooned off from what could be going out externally with people now getting news and information from wherever they want, then at least there continue to be heads at the table who are put in places that they're told to try to negotiate. So I was just wondering if you could maybe speak historically to how Congress has and hasn't operated vis-a-vis the climate we're at now.
Yeah, I'll just briefly start. You know, the budgetary process is a 20th century device, and second half of the 20th century in the current sort of process. And there have been periods when the normal order worked, and we got a budget, and a budget is really 13 appropriations and spending bills, and many years we would actually pass the budget and have it in place on time, but for the last 15 years it's been very sporadic, and I think we haven't actually had a budget, certainly out of the Senate, in 4 years. So the idea that, and over the course of the last 6 months or so, Paul Ryan, who's the head of the Budget Committee in the House, had the strategic sense that he should not go to conference committee with Patty Murray until this set of fights had been concluded, and he thought won by the Republicans. If they could force compromise on the Democrats on their grounds, that budget compromise could then be made when Republicans had a winning hand. And so one of the things that makes him look a little peaked when you see him on the news over the last week or so is that having lost that fight, his strategy of not going to conference is now being forced on him with a very short time frame. So people call this the regular order, meaning that we're now getting a House and a Senate budget into conference. But we're in conference in a very short time frame, so we can be hopeful but not confident.
Hi. Speaking of compromise, I see a lot of times when two sides come to the table to negotiate about a future deal, they're still very stuck in the past. There's a lot of blame going on each side, and the talks are very backwards looking. My question is, how do you shift the conversation so that it's forward looking?
It's basically the first thing you do with mediation when you get people at the table is you acknowledge the past, you acknowledge the history. You say, this is what got you to the table today, but talking about the past isn't what's going to get you to be able to be in the same room with each other when you go home tonight. And mediation and conflict resolution are all about going from today, looking at the present, kind of being in that kind of present moment, and coming up with something that you can live with for the future. Acknowledging the past is kind of helpful, but not necessarily even all that helpful. And you've got to figure out, why are you here today? What's brought you to the table today? It's a desire to get things better. And getting things better isn't sticking in the past. It's what do we do? How do we talk about the future? What do we focus on right now? If I make a suggestion or an offer, how are you going to think about that? How are you going to take it? In couples that are very distressed, you get a lot of, well, any idea that you say, I'm going to just immediately assume is good for you and bad for me. So you've got this kind of trust issues that you were talking about before. With close relationships, it's kind of hard to say, well, let's write out a legal contract for what our relationship will be. But you are actually starting to see post-nuptial agreements, where people will actually have agreements for their marriage after the marriage has already occurred. And so you do have those kinds of agreements that say, how do I trust that you are going to do in the future what you're going to say? Even just discussions of trust still are rooted in the kind of past, rooted in that history. But you say, you're here today. That's a statement that you want things to get better, you want things to improve. And one of the most important characteristics is going to be this sort of optimism for the future, and this belief that things will be better, or at least can be better. So you explicitly acknowledge when people start going, well, you did this, you did that, and 10 years ago, if you know people who've been married for 50, 60 years, they will tell you what their fights have been about. And a lot of times they still relive fights that they had when they were in their 20s, and they're in the nursing home, sipping tea, reliving that fight that they had. They're still together, but they've gotten past it. And you have to have that commitment and that sort of sense of optimism for the future. And acknowledging there may be some past difficulties, but you'd even basically cut people off and say, this is not necessarily productive to just rehash what's gone on before. Let's say, why are you here today? What do you want? And what is going to make things work for having this one floor? You just kind of direct it to the present.
Is there a difference, though, between that and the personal level, which makes perfect sense, because at the personal level, you're saying, I want this marriage to work, I don't want it to go off the cliff. And at the political level, I mean, I think there are some people who say, going off the cliff would really be fun. It would be a good idea. We should go off the cliff. I mean, I think some Tea Party people honestly believe that the best thing that could have happened to the United States would have been default. And they would say, if we would default on our debt, then we would have to restructure our economy. We would have to stop wasting money on all of the things we do. There are 5 departments in the government we would shut down, but your governor only can remember 4 of them. But there must be, you know, and they would move forward. And so what I'm wondering is at the political level, is there a sense in which some people simply would not ever want to solve the problem, because solving the problem removes their raison d'etre? I mean, it's kind of like in Ireland, where the overwhelming majority of the people in Ireland said we've had enough, but for some of the people in both the Provos and the IRA, the only thing they knew was to be terrorists. And if you take the war away, they have nothing else to do. And so what I wonder with at least some people, and Ted Cruz might be one, if you take it away, if you actually compromise, then he doesn't have any reason to exist anymore. His only existence is to take us over the cliff.
I think if you look at it, it will sort of go in between sitting across the table from 2 people who are married and Ted Cruz in the House and Senate, and look at large negotiations, say contract negotiations, which I'm involved in a lot. The worst thing to do is to deny that the past is there, because it's going to be there. I mean, every interaction that you have brings with it something that happened before, and if you don't acknowledge that, then you have the opportunity to have a very unsuccessful discussion. Thinking about a particular negotiation in which the one round of negotiations resulted in basically one side being forced to accept huge pay cuts to keep the company alive. And the next round of bargaining, the mantra on the part of the union was restore and more. And so they were totally backward facing when they started the discussion. And to have ignored them would have been disastrous, because they were completely focused on the fact that they took a bath last time. This time the company was going to take a bath. And I actually talked to one of the guys who was one of those leaders and said, you do understand if you get your way, the company's going to shut down, you're going to be out of a job. Well, yeah. Okay, you understand that. And so the challenge is, how do you go from there to, yeah, that's right, we're going to shut them down. How do you go from there and acknowledge the pain in the past and say, okay, what's the dynamic right now?
But the difference is for the person employed at the company, however much he may want to see me to take this job and shove it, the reality is he needs the job to pay his bills. And I think one of the peculiarities of our current political system is that the crazies have nothing personal at stake other than whether they get reelected. And that, I think, makes it a fundamentally more dangerous kind of negotiations, because the reality is, if we had defaulted on our debt, it would not have affected Ted Cruz's political career. It would not have, it's unlikely that he would lose his next election. He wouldn't lose his house, he wouldn't lose his car, his mortgage would still be there. He'd still be able to go to the Senate gym and work out. And so I wonder if part of the problem is that there's no patriotic altruism on the part of people who are or some people who are in politics, who say, I don't care what happens to the country because I have a vision of what's best for me, which is to take us over the cliff.
described, of course, is a Madisonian infection. Exactly the problem he saw at his paper, and exactly the problem he hoped to solve by creating a national structure. And the problem that was kind of mitigated and filtered through the invention of political parties which were necessary. And the wheel goes round and round.
There's one over here and one over there.
Oh, sorry. So I'm curious, I'm with the Embry Family Foundation. I just want to thank you all for a really interesting discussion today. How do we become more forward-thinking when it comes to racial equity? This is an area that's of our focus at the Embry Family Foundation. We just launched a forum that we call Dallas Faces Race. We're helping to bring a conference here next year that's never been brought to the South called Facing Race. And, you know, with the recognition that there has to be a nod toward the past, but how do we become more forward-thinking about racial equity when it's so, a lot of that bias is very systemic, and you know, a lot of folks just don't want to have to start dismantling that system, or don't have the forward thinking to be able to do it.
You're looking at me. Since I raised it. Well, I think in part you begin by, and to some extent I may disagree with the two people who do conflict resolution in psychology. I think in part it has to be deeply historical. I think it is deeply important for those who have the power in this country, which is predominantly people of European ancestry, to come to terms with the enormous pain of race, the enormous pain of slavery, the enormous pain of segregation. And I think it also needs to be spelled out in black and white terms that people can understand. I mean, I have friends, for example, who have been advocates of reparations suits for slavery. I think reparations suits for slavery are a complete waste of time. They're not going to go anywhere. You can't litigate the past. You can't have dead plaintiffs suing dead defendants over things that happened 150 years ago. But you could have a reparations suit based on all of those African Americans who were unable to go to a high school after 1954 because there was no high school open to them throughout various portions of the South. And if you did a suit like that, you could bring in an economist who could say that the fact that, for instance, in Delaware, there was only one high school open to blacks, and you know, you could say that all the people who could not go to high school, this is what their economic loss was, on average, over their working life, because they didn't have a high school degree. This is what your economic cost was. And I'm not suggesting, again, that the litigation is the model, so much as I'm suggesting that one of the things that you should teach at your conference is to explain to people just what the huge cost in terms of economics, health, education have been for racial prejudice. Because once people begin to see that, and it can't be about, you know, you're bad because you know, I'm not bad because this happened to you, but I should know that this happened to you, and maybe that helps me understand why we have to come together and change things. So that's where I'd start. I hope we can talk afterwards.
And one of the problems
is that this is so huge because it is entwined throughout the entire economy and society, distribution of wealth. I mentioned that in Texas, blacks and Hispanics make just a little bit more than half what Anglos do for median family income. Unemployment rates for blacks and Hispanics are 3, sometimes 4 times what they are for whites. Lack of insurance for Hispanics and blacks are 3 and 4 times what they are for whites. So the entire structure of the economy, not just the wage system, but the wealth system is a result of racial privilege and exclusion over the course of hundreds of years. So it's very difficult to see how you would take that apart. And once you start talking about it, you can tell people the fact that you were privileged historically doesn't make you a bad person, but the first thought through that person's mind is, what is this going to cost? And where's that money going to come from? And the answer is, well, it's going to come from the people who have the money. And the people who have the money are generally Anglo. And so, I think you look at the way Texas is structured politically, and I think one of the messages is we ain't paying.
In conflict resolution theory, there's an entire set of literature that talks about what do you do when a conflict isn't really resolved? Because it's very different from mediation. Mediators tend to think, I'm there to get a resolution, I'm there to solve this problem. And there are just a raft of things that are probably in the short term, medium term, maybe even the long term, unresolved. So what do you do with it? How do you stay with that conflict? How do you transform it in some way? And so some of the literature on peace building, capacity building, community building, really speaks to things like that. It's not truth and reconciliation, or whether you have truth and reconciliation, whether you just have reconciliation. Because in Ireland, in South Africa, they ran truth and reconciliation councils. In Ireland, they didn't. They ran reconciliation. Truth is not peace.
But I think if you don't have the truth, I mean, you can still find people who will say slavery wasn't really such a bad thing, or segregation wasn't so terrible, or if only these people would go look for a job, they wouldn't be at a 52% of leaving. And so I think, in fact, one thought you might have is to essentially create a historical truth and reconciliation commission or committee or presentation, because I think part of the problem is that we have never faced the reality of our own past. The only country I know that faces the reality of its own past is Germany. When I go to Germany, they are prepared to say our now grandparents were really bad actors. They did really horrible things to people. We are deeply embarrassed by what they did. And part of our national economic renaissance has to go to understanding that and to recapture the culture that we destroyed and to build monuments to those people who we harmed. You can't get that here.
Well, and yet there are German skinheads, and there are Germans who don't believe that. And it took them a while to get even as far as they are now. I was in Berlin in 1980 when the very first museum exhibition that addressed the notion of the Third Reich opened in Berlin. So it took them from 1980 to even talk about it. And so, but again, what I'm saying is this is not something we're going to do tomorrow. This is not a resolvable issue. This is an issue where you have to look and see how can I begin to transform the way people think about this. Maybe even redefine what their roles are. One of the things that happened in Northern Ireland I found very interesting is they started talking in a discussion circle about what had happened in the North of Ireland. And they invited people in as people who had been combatants and people who had been innocent bystanders of the violence. And they got almost no discussion going on. And they invited the same people back after a little bit of work and said, you're not coming back in the role you were before. Everybody in this room suffered something as a result of the trouble. What was it? And so you have somebody sitting on one side of the circle who engaged in violent behavior, and somebody sitting on the other side of the circle whose brother was killed by the person sitting on the other side of the circle. But you find out that that person lost a cousin to violence on the other side. And when everybody started talking about the fact that everybody suffered, that changed the discussion entirely. Now, that's a specific example, but there are ways that you can begin to transform the conversation that gets away from blame, gets away from all the rest of it, and says, okay, what do we do going forward? How do we live with each other? How do we stay with this stuff?
But that doesn't work when you're talking about slavery and segregation, because the fact is that the slave owners did not suffer. And the only suffering is when they took, they'll say that our suffering was when they took our slaves from us.
I didn't offer it as a blueprint. What I said was there are ways to transform conflict.
Well, Paul and I are both historians, and we both published on this aspect, very close to each other, in fact. And both of us are trying to get this point across. You have to hammer it and hammer it and hammer it Because there are always going to be people who will say, well, wasn't that too bad, but the real story is. And the real story is that all of these issues in our lives and in our history are wrapped around one another. We can't understand American freedom without understanding American slavery. We can't understand American prosperity without understanding American poverty. They are connected. If we get that story across, then we have perhaps a hope something like what was achieved by what you just described.
It's a way to talk to one another about terribly divisive problems. And if you can't talk about them, you have no place to go.
Right. And that will be our last word. It's 5 o'clock, so thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you, everyone in the audience.
Reception outside, one with something to drink.
Oh, looks like.
Yeah.
That's good.
Could you